Star Trek Enterprise is not my favorite Trek series. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike it, and the series has grown on me since I first watched it, and I actually think I prefer it over Voyager, especially in its later seasons. But there are a number of issues and nitpicks that I have with Enterprise, from an over-reliance on romance plots and scenes featuring the characters in their underpants, to trying so hard to prove it is a Star Trek show that it forgets it's a prequel to the original series and reads and looks at times like a TNG contemporary. But we're not here to talk about all my issues with Enterprise or the greater question of Trek's convoluted and dysfunctional internal chronology. Instead, we're here to talk about a single issue that I have with how Enterprise depicts the 22nd century. And that is the ship which has been gracing your screen since, well, not since the video's start, but it's on screen now. That is the D5 class battlecruiser. The D5 appears to be the standard large Klingon combatant of the 22nd century, appearing throughout Enterprise, and seems to follow Klingon design doctrine which we would continue to see throughout following centuries, with a prominent head section placed well forward of the main body, which features most of the ship's sensors, command and control centers, torpedo armament, and the like. The main body, which is some distance back, features crew housing, engines, cargo bays, shuttle bays, and probably troop areas. From this section juts out the ship's warp nacelles, which provide faster-than-light capability for the vessel. The ship is sleeker than the vessels which are understood to follow it, such as the D7, seemingly more streamlined for whatever reason, and in my opinion it looks really cool. I also don't really have an issue with how the ship looks. I think it fits in very well with other ships from the show. The D5, as a large Klingon cruiser, fits into the D lineage, of which the later D7 is also a member, unsurprisingly. Now, we really only know about a few of these ships, one of which is the D5, of course, but we also know of the D7 and a few others. I don't count the supposedly earlier D4, as it's an unholy last-minute thrown-together hodgepodge and reuse of an earlier model, but we also have the D13 class Bird of Prey from Next Generation, which is cool. Oh well. Now, it's not clear if the D series gets its name from internal Klingon sources or outside ones. I tend to assume that the D designator is just a generic designator. The D designator is a generic designation for Klingon cruisers employed by Starfleet. Similar to how at several points in our own history, foreign vessels and technologies have been given code names to make it easier to refer to them quickly by foreign nations that are not familiar with them. The MiG-21 Fishbed, the Zero, these are not the original names of these aircraft, but we refer to them as such because we didn't know their internal designations, and also we're English and they're Japanese or Russian, so they have names that are difficult to pronounce. There could be something very similar going on with the Klingons. This, of course, is not canon, but I can't see the Klingons just choosing to name their classes sequentially after a character in the Latin alphabet. So in my headcanon at least, the D designator is something that is Starfleet specific, which makes it a bit weird that it's an Enterprise, but maybe it's a adaptation of an earlier Vulcan designation. I don't know. We can make that work. We can workshop it. Now that we have established what the D5 is and how it fits into the broader lore of the Klingon Navy, we come to why I have a major issue with the ship and its place in Star Trek history. And that is dates. And I don't mean the romantic kind or the fruit, I mean dates as in time. We first see the D5 in the middle of the 22nd century, and we have to assume that it's a fairly new ship at the time. Well, less than a decade old, let's say, prior to the start of Enterprise. But then we have the D7, which we see in service over a century later during the run of the original series in the 2260s. And the D7 itself is supposedly a newer ship, even if it's not brand new by the time we first see it. I assume that the D5 had a nice and long service life, during probably half of which it was the latest and greatest ship in the fleet. I would guess 40 or so years, 20 of which the D5 was top of the line, in the Empire's space fleet. So if we assume that the D5 entered service in 2150, and the D7 entered service in 2260, though 2250 might work, that's 110 years. And then we assume that the Klingons would not bring any successor into service for a period of 20 years to replace the D5 or until the 2170s. That still leaves us with a 90-year period where we're supposed to believe that there is just one ship, the D6, which served as the lineage between the two designs. And that's a problem, obviously. So, are there any possible ways in which we can make this make sense and explain how this gap in the Klingon fleet does make sense? Well, yeah. I mean, this is a Star Trek show, Star Trek YouTube channel. We're full of ideas on how to make this thing work. We think this out way more than the showrunners ever did. The first possibility is that between when we first see the D5 and the start of the original series, that the Klingon Empire and Federation stopped interacting with one another, and that the D6 was the first ship seen after contact between the two powers was resumed. Note that this also relies on the D designator being something used not by the Klingons. The idea has some merit, though, as in several scenes we see mention that the Federation and Klingons had been involved in a Cold War for 75 or so years. This being said in the 2280s, which would mean that there was either a period where the Klingons and Federation had a fairly good relationship, unlikely, or that neither side interacted much with one another for several decades after the end of the Enterprise era. Discovery in its early seasons also seems to back this up, but then I tend not to take anything shown in Discovery very seriously, as that show takes itself seriously enough for the both of us. The second theory relies on the D designation being the invention of someone other than the Klingons, as does the first. Perhaps the Vulcans had created the initial designation for Klingon ships, which they later passed on to Earth during Enterprise, only for Starfleet to later start their own coding name scheme system for Klingon ships, which used the same letter as the earlier Vulcan system. This does bring us to the question of why the Vulcans would use Latin letters to refer to the Klingon fleet, but as mentioned earlier, perhaps the Vulcans adapted their system to be more approachable to the humans aboard the Enterprise. Maybe their system employed the fourth letter of their equivalent to an alphabet, and T'Pol simply substituted for the fourth Vulcan character for the English equivalent. And honestly, this theory is probably my favorite out of everything else here. Especially because it allows the possibility for a lot more Klingon ships in the century between Enterprise and the original series. It's probably my favorite out of everything, but there's one more option. It's the simplest. Possibly the option that takes the least amount of brain power to answer this conundrum and is the most obvious, than whatever I've invented, is that Klingon ships just have longer lives than their Starfleet counterparts, having longer times in service than Starfleet ships and being replaced in production less frequently. This is backed up by how long it seems that the D7 and the Klingon Bird of Prey lasts in service, but at the same time I think that there's a good argument that there's significant contextual reasons why those ships would last so long, ranging from period of technological stagnation, which we don't really see between Enterprise and the original series, and general Klingon imperial problems at home. But this is definitely the most boring of the options suggested. Really, I think we would be safe to just say that the writers of Enterprise went the lazy route when it came to naming Klingon ships in the show, and just picked a number lower than 7 and went with it when it came to naming their new cruiser made for the series, and leave it at that. But this is even more boring, and this way I don't get to make a big long video about a single Klingon ship and how it breaks the universe a slight amount. That being said, I would argue that the answer is probably a combination of the 3 earlier mentioned options. Klingon ships serve for long periods compared to Starfleet vessels, The Empire and Federation had a long period where they didn't interact much, and finally Starfleet reset their naming convention for Klingon ships at some point. This fits into the whole that there's seldom one cause for any one thing quite nicely, and just, it lets you have a lot more Klingon ships, and I like that because the Klingon fleet is not very diverse. As somebody that makes videos about imaginary ships, the more the merrier. So, there's that. Thanks for enjoying this video. If you did enjoy it, be sure to give it a like, comment, subscribe to the channel, all of that stuff. As you saw at the outset, this video is made possible by the channel's Patreon. There's a Patreon page below that gets you some special perks. You get to see videos in advance, all of that fun stuff. You can vote on what video topics you want to see covered, what ships you want to see covered, and always, feel free on YouTube comments to leave a suggestion for a ship that you would want to review, because I'm totally willing to do that. So, do that if you want to. With that said, have a nice day. I think I've gone on long enough about this topic, and I will see you all in the next video.